Hi, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. Well, I took a couple days off from reading stories, but I'm back and we'll continue reading in our book, By the Shores of Silver Lake by Laura Ingalls Wilder. If you remember, on the last day I read, they had had a wonderful Christmas that they shared with Mr. and Mrs. Boast, who surprised them by coming back so soon during the hard part of the winter. Okay, we're in chapter 22, Happy Winter Days. And I'll show you a little picture here. There's the picture we've got. The Christmassy feeling lasted day after day. Every morning, Mrs. Boast did her breakfast work quickly and came to spend time with the other girls, as she said. She was always merry and full of fun, and always so pretty with her soft dark hair and laughing blue eyes and the bright color in her cheeks. That first week, the sun shone brightly. There was no wind, and in 6 days, all the snow was gone. The prairie showed bare and brown, and the air seemed warm as milk. Mrs. Boast had cooked the New Year dinner. "You can all crowd into my little place for once," she said. She let Laura help her move things. They put the table on the bed and opened the door wide against the wall. Then they set the table in the exact middle of the house. One corner of it almost touched the stove, and the other end was almost against the bed. But there was room for them to all come in single file and sit around it. Mrs. Boast sat by the stove and served the food from the hot top. First, there was oyster soup. In all her life, Laura had never tasted anything so good as that savory, fragrant, sea-tasting hot milk, with golden dots of melted cream and black specks of pepper on its top, and the little dark canned oysters on its bottom. She sipped slowly from her spoon to keep the taste going over her tongue as long as she could. And with this soup, there were little round oyster crackers. The little oyster crackers were like dog crackers, and they tasted better because they were so light and small. When the last drop of soup was gone, the last crackers divided and crunched. There were hot biscuits with honey and dried raspberry sauce, and then a big dishpan full of tender, salty popcorn that had been keeping hot on the back of the stove. That was the New Year's Eve dinner. It was light but filling. There was something fashionable about it because it was so odd and new and so different, and so daintily served on Mrs. Boast's pretty dishes and brand new tablecloth. Afterwards, they sat talking in the little house with the soft air coming in, and beyond the open door, the brown prairie stretching far away and the soft blue sky curving down to meet it. "I've never tasted finer honey, Mrs. Boast," said Pa. "I'm glad you brought it out from Iowa." "The oysters, too," said Ma. "I don't know when I had such a treat for dinner." "It's a good beginning for 1880, Pa declared. Do you know how long ago that was? That was 140, almost 43 years, 143 years ago. The 70s haven't been so bad, but it looks like the 80s will be better. If this is a sample of a Dakota winter, we're all lucky we came out west. Certainly is fine country, Mr. Boast agreed. I'm glad I got my claim filed on 160 acres of it. I wish you had, Ingles. I'll have it before I'm a week older, said Pa. I've been waiting for the land office to open in Brookings to save me more than a week's travel to Yankton and back. They said that Brookings office would be open first of the year, and by Jove, with this weather like this, I'm starting out tomorrow, if Carolyn says so. I do, Charles, Ma said quietly. Her eyes, her whole face were shining with gladness because now, so soon, Pa would surely have their homestead. That settles it, said Pa. Not that I figured there's any danger of being too late, but it might as well be done and over with. The sooner the better, Ingles, Mr. Bose said. I tell you, you've got no notion what the rush is going to be this spring. Well, nobody will be here quicker than I'll be, Pa answered. Starting before sunup, I ought to show up at the land office bright and early day after tomorrow morning. So if you folks want to send any letters back to Iowa, get them fixed up and I'll take them along and mail them in Brookings. That ended the Christmas dinner. Mrs. Bose and Ma were writing letters that afternoon, and Ma packed a lunch for Pa to take with him. But at nightfall, a wind full of snow was blowing and frost began to creep up on the window panes again. This is no kind of weather to go anywhere, Pa said. Don't worry about the homestead, Carolyn. I'll get it. Yes, Charles, I know you will, Ma replied. In the stormy weather, Pa tended his trap lines and stretched the skins to dry. Mr. Bose hauled brushwood from Lake Henry and chopped it up to burn, for he had no coal. And every day Mrs. Bose came. Often when the sun was shining, she and Laura and Carrie, well wrapped up, played in the deep snow together. They wrestled and ran and threw snowballs, and one day they made a snowman. And hand in hand in the sharp, bright cold, the three of them ran and slid on the ice of Silver Lake. Laura had never laughed so much. Late one afternoon, when they'd been sliding and were coming home warm and breathless, Mrs. Bose said, Laura, come over to my house a minute. Laura went with her, and Mrs. Bose showed her a tall stack of newspapers. I had brought all these New York ledgers from Iowa. Take as many as you can carry, she said. When you read them, bring them back and get some more. Laura ran all the way home with an armful of papers. She burst into the house and dropped them on Mary's lap. See, Mary? See what I brought, she cried. Stories, they're all stories. Oh, hurry up and get the supper work done so we can read, Mary said eagerly. But Ma said, never mind the work, Laura. Read us a story. So, while Ma and Carrie got supper, Laura began to read to them all from the wonderful stories about dwarfs and caves and robbers where they lived, and a beautiful lady who was lost in the caves. At the most exciting part, she suddenly came to the words, to be continued. And there was not another word of that story. Oh, dear me, we'll never know what became of the lady, Mary lamented. Laura, why do you suppose they print only part of a story? Why do they do that, Ma? They don't, said Ma. Look at the next paper. Laura looked, and at the next, and the next, and the next. Oh, here it is, she cried. And more, and it goes right on through the pile. It's all here, Mary. Here it says, the end. It's a continued story, said Ma. Laura and Mary had never heard of a continued story, but Ma had. Well, Mary said contentedly, now we can save the next part for tomorrow. Every day we can read one part, and that will make the stories last longer." "That's my wise girls," said Ma. So Laura did not say that she would rather read as fast as she could. She laid the papers carefully away. Every day she read one more part of the story, and then they wondered until the next day what happened to the beautiful lady. On stormy nights, Mrs. Bose brought her sewing or knitting, and those were cozy days of reading and talking. One day, Mrs. Bose told them about whatnots. She said that everyone in Iowa was making whatnots, and she would show them how. So she told Pa how to make the shelves, 3-cornered to fit in a corner. He made 5 shelves of graduated sizes, the largest at the bottom and the smallest at the top, all fastened solidly with a narrow strip of board between them. When he had finished, the whatnot fitted snugly into the corner of the room and stood firmly on 3 legs. Its top shelf was as high as Ma could easily reach. Then Mrs. Bose cut a curtain of pasteboard to hang from the edge of each shelf. She scalloped the bottom of the pasteboard, a large scallop in the middle. So scallop is up and down like that. And smaller scallop on each side. The pieces of pasteboard and the scallops were graduated like the shelves, from large at the bottom to smaller at the top. Next, Mrs. Bose showed them how to cut and fold small squares of heavy wrapping paper. They folded each square cornerwise and then across and pressed it smooth. When dozens of squares were folded, Mrs. Bose showed Laura how to sew them into rows on the pasteboard, close together with points down. Each row overlapped the row below it, and each point must lie between 2 points of the row above it, or below it. And the rows must follow the scallop's curves. While they worked in the snug, cozy house, they told stories and sang and talked. Ma and Mrs. Bose talked mostly about the homesteads. Mrs. Bose had seeds enough for 2 gardens. She said she would divide them with Ma, so Ma need not worry about seeds. When the town was built, there might not be seeds in town to sell, but then again, there might be. So Mrs. Bose had brought plenty from the gardens of her friends in Iowa. "I'll be thankful when we're settled," Ma said. "This is the last move we're going to make. Mr. Ingles agreed to that when we left Minnesota. My girls are going to have schooling and learn a civilized life." Laura did not know whether she wanted to be settled down. When she had schooling, she would have to teach school, and she would rather think of something else. She could hum very softly without interrupting the talk, and then when Mom and Mrs. Bose and Mary and Carrie would sing along with her. Mrs. Bose had taught them 2 new songs. Laura liked them. The Gypsy's Warning was one, and it goes something like this. "Do not trust him, gentle lady, though his voice be low and sweet. Heed not him who kneels before you, gently pleading at your feet. Now the life is in the morning, cloud not this thy happy lot. Listen to the gypsy warning, gentle lady, heed him not." The other new song was "When I Was 1 and 20, Nell and you were 17. It was Mr. Bose's favorite song. He had been 21 when he met Mrs. Bose, and she had been 17. Her name was really Ella, but Mr. Bose called her Nell. At last, the 5 pasteboard pieces were neatly covered with rows and above rows of little paper points, and no stitches showed except along the top of the row. When Mrs. Bow sewed a wide strip of brown paper above these stitches and folded it over to hide them. Finally, they tacked each pasteboard curtain to the shelf. The stiff scallop, covered with stiff little paper points, hung down stiffly. Then Pa carefully painted the whole whatnot, and all the little paper points were rich dark brown. When the paint dried, they set the whatnot in the corner behind Mary's chair. "So, what is a whatnot?" Pa asked. "Yes," said Ma. "Isn't it pretty?" "Oh," he said, "that's a whatnot." "It's a neat job," said Pa. "Mrs. Bow said they're all the rage in Iowa." "Well, she ought to know," Pa agreed. "And there's nothing in Iowa that's too good for you, Carolyn." But the best time of all was after supper. Every evening Pa played the fiddle, and now Mr. Boast and Mrs. Boast's beautiful voices rounded out the singing. Gaily Pa played and sang. "When I was young and single, I could make the money jingle, and the world went well with me then, oh then. The world went with me then, well with me then. I married a wife, oh then, oh then. I married a wife, oh then. I married a wife, she was the joy of my life, and the world went well with me." The song went on to say that she was such a good wife after all, so Pa never sang the rest of it. His eyes twinkled at Ma while the music laughed and whirled, and he would sing, "She can make a cherry pie, Billy boy, Billy boy. She can make a cherry pie, charming Billy. She can make a cherry pie with a twinkle in her eye. But she's a young thing and cannot leave her mother." The music would go on rollicking while only Pa and Mr. Bow sang. "I bet my money on the bobtail mare, and you bet yours on the gray." Even with songs, Ma did not approve of gambling, but her toe could not stop from tapping while Pa played such tunes. Then, every evening they all sang one round. Mr. Bow's tenor would begin, "Three blind mice," and then go on, while Mrs. Bow also began, "Three blind mice." And they would go through each person like that. When Mr. Bose reached the end of the song, he began it again without stopping, and they all followed, each behind the other. "Three blind mice, three blind mice. They all ran after the farmer's wife. She cut off their tails with a carving knife. Did you ever hear such a tale in your life of three blind mice?" They kept singing until someone laughed, and then the song ended, tagged and breathless and laughing, and Pa would play some of the old songs to go to sleep on. "Nellie was a lady, last night she died. Oh, toll the bell for lovely Nell, my old Virginia bride." And, "Oh, do you remember sweet Alice Ben Bolt, sweet Alice with eyes so brown, who wept with delight when you gave her a smile and trembled with fear at your frown? And, oft in the steely night, ere slumber's chain has bound me, sweet memory brings the light of other days around me." Laura had never been so happy, and for some reason she was happiest of all when they were singing. I think that's the end of it is the end of the chapter. I think the singing for them was just such a special family time. It was just fun and lighthearted. What type of fun things do you like to do with your family? Or maybe you're like me and you don't have too much family real close to you. You can also remember the things that you did love. Well, it's Maria from Still Dreaming Homestead. I want to pray blessings on you and yours, in your house, out of your house, in the day and the night. And whatever you do, keep dreaming. All right, good night.